And now I'm going to introduce the speaker, Aaron Brown. Tonight we will hear from Aaron Brown from both a deep historical and personal connection to the Iron Range that will make this presentation especially compelling to all of us. His presentation, entitled "The World That Grew from Stumps and Slash," and I'm going to tell you that title kind of confounded me. So I said, "Nancy, what's this all about?" She said, "It's about woods and the trees and all of that." So we're going to hear about that. We'll focus on the history of northern Minnesota's old growth forests and the impact of logging and mining on the landscape and its people. We will learn about how the early logging and we will hear about how the early logging era and mining area transformed a wilderness into a new world. He will also present some of the enduring lessons we can learn from this period of significant change, particularly as similar transformations are likely to occur again. Aaron is an author, columnist, and a new editorial board member of the Minnesota Star Tribune. A lifelong Iron Ranger who grew up in a family-owned salvage yard, Aaron spent 21 years teaching communications at Minnesota North College in Hibbing. He is the author of Overburden, Modern Life on the Iron Range, and is currently writing a new book for the University of Minnesota Press about Hibbing Mayor Victor Power and his historic battle with U.S. Steel. He also publishes MinnesotaBrown.com and hosts several podcasts on Iron Range history and culture. I am very pleased to introduce you to Aaron J. Brown.
All right. Oh, there we go. Yeah. All right. Early challenge. I begin today with two strikes against me, and I want to acknowledge them right up front. The first is that I never want to be the guy in between a large group of people and dinner. But I will gently get you to dinner, and it will be, I hope, entertaining. The second thing is, when I speak to local historical societies, I've learned a few things. One of the main things, I just want to get it out of the way first, it's true. You do know more than me. And you can tell me a heck of a lot about the things that I'm talking about, and I just want to acknowledge that. I like to point out that I'm not a trained historian. I'm what you might call a histrotainer. It's a narrative history that I like to speak with. I do check my facts and get things straight, but I like to talk, and that's what I'll be talking about tonight, is just images, ideas, and things you might not have thought of when it comes to a lot of historical facts and information that we might be more familiar with. And of course, as was pointed out in the introduction, a lot of my background is in the Hibbing area. And I know, if you know anyone from Hibbing, they will tell you that the Iron Range begins and ends with Hibbing. And I know from experience that that's not necessarily true. In fact, it is an honor. I believe this is the first time I've spoken in Tower, which the Charlemagne Tower and the first ore out of Minnesota here on the Vermilion Range. Well aware that the Vermilion Range was here first and was producing iron first. And I like to always point out, in fact, this summer I've now gotten to give talks on all three iron ranges of the producing iron ranges in Minnesota, and I have a connection to all three through my grandfather. Ward Brown's still with us, by the way. He's probably watching TV right now. He was an underground miner on all three ranges, and there's got to be a few of them out there left, but probably not too many. And so he's told me, in fact, not only did he work in three underground mines, or on all three ranges in underground mines, but he actually almost died on all three iron ranges. There were three specific dangerous things that occurred on each of the iron ranges. And here, it was actually up in Ely. He was working, I believe it was the Chandler. I gotta check on that. But one of the iron ranges, not the Pioneer, one of the other ones, the wetter one, someone here knows, the wet one, because he was down at the bottom of this thing and he was a mechanic and he was fixing the pump that pumped out the water from the underground mines. If you know anything about mining, above ground or below ground, pumps very important. And when they're not running, water fills in the place where you are. And so my grandfather, with a lamp on his head, was fixing a broken pump with water at his feet, water at his ankles, water at his knees, And it was him or the pump, it was one or the other. It was going to be one or the other. And he did survive that escapade. And a few other scrapes along the way, and I'm still here as a result. So a family history in mining and a family history in this place, going back 5 generations. I'm 5th. My kids are the 6th to be raised somewhere in the general vicinity of the Mesabi or Vermilion or Cuyuna Iron Ranges. And so I'm glad to be here in Tower. The talk tonight, a world that grew from stumps and slash, and yeah, those are some logging terms. Stumps, of course, are what you have when you cut trees down. And slash is the pile of all the refuse, the extra branches, the things that are not lumber per se, things that are not going to be turned into lumber and saleable products. And what I like to point out about this is a white pine, I think it's a white pine, from a special place not so far from where I live today in Itasca County, which is the Lost 40. And I don't know if you've ever been to the Lost 40, but it's kind of what they call a mapmaker's error, just a strange anomaly where they called something a lake that was in fact land, and as a result it never got logged, ever. It's never been logged. It is exactly as it was left. Of course, trees have grown and fallen down and lived and died, and lots of animals and things have passed through, and fires and other things too, but it was never logged. And as a result, it's kind of a time capsule of the way the forest was and the way it operated before logging, before mining. And it's a great thing to go check out. It was actually quite special to me, not because trees, you don't necessarily go like, yes, a white pine, I've never seen one before. I know we've all seen a white pine or a red pine, and they're beautiful big trees. But it's what happens when you leave them alone and they grow in their natural ecosystem. You see a really complex world underneath those trees. And that's something that was really interesting. That was my biggest takeaway. It smelled different. I don't know if that makes sense, but the place doesn't smell like the woods that I walk through in other places with the same trees. It's because there's different undergrowth, there's more fungi, there's different things that influence what you experience when you walk through a forest like that. And that got me thinking about not only the beauty of a tree, but the world that we lived in, that we people lived in prior to the world we live in now, where we take cars and go from town to town. And I drove on Highway 22 across the top end of the through Bear River and Bearville and all that to get here, and it was nice. I had the radio on. I was drinking a Diet Mountain Dew. It was great, and I got to really open up that minivan on the open stretches. It was a lot of fun. But getting around and seeing the world back in the late 1800s, early 1900s was a very different world. More images of the Lost 40. And I'll skip this. I'll come back to this. But I want to talk about, in the book that I'm writing, Power in the Wilderness, about Victor Power, who you very briefly saw on screen, I talk a little bit about the wilderness, the thing that was here before the colonization and industrialization of our region. And there was an image, and I heard it years ago, like 20 years ago I first read about it, and it's come up a couple times. It's now been quoted in a few books. R.L. Giffen in Hibbing, who was a lot of things. He ran the St. Louis County Fair for many years, and he was a miner and a mining cop and a businessman, and he did a lot of things. But in 1930, so not quite 100 years ago, he spoke at a historical society dinner, just something like this, pretty much. And he was telling people about the forest he saw before mining, before people started mining. He was talking about a forest that was near Mountain Iron, probably where Mintac is now, just generally speaking. And he was standing on a tall hill, and he was looking out at what he described as a veritable ocean of pine, inexhaustible, enough to last for ages, as I thought at the time. You hear this a lot in narratives from the early part of our, Euro-American lives here in this region. You hear people talk about, boy, we got here and there was a ton of resources. You wouldn't believe all the logs and iron ore and everything else that we had. It was going to last forever. And of course, what they found, particularly as it relates to the logs, it was those white pines, those big, huge 200, 300, 400 and older year old white pines were in fact exhaustible. They exhausted them not only in short order, but in less than 10 years from the time he saw them. They were all gone, all the way up here. Maybe I think it was a little later as you got further into some of these northern, in the northern parts, just because there were no roads and it was difficult, and if you didn't have a river, you couldn't get the logs out. But just to highlight, in 1891, an ocean of pine, unlike anything any of us today have seen in all likelihood, just because of how tall. And this image that I have is a print that an artist made, and it's one of my favorites. I don't know, my wife doesn't think it's any hot stuff, but I think it's cool because it kind of shows what I experienced in the Lost 40 that day. The trees are one part of the story, but the undergrowth and everything underneath is another part of the story. And there's an Ojibwe legend that said a squirrel could run from the tops of the white pines in Minnesota all the way to the East Coast, just on the pines, just walking and jumping across pine tree to pine tree. That's how big and broad that forest was before we cut it down. But as and we know what happened, and this is part of our story, is we cut down, and these trees built things. They built cities. They built Chicago, for one thing, and then they built it again when it burned down. And it built a lot of things, and a lot of these trees were used, and I'll talk about this in a second, is timbers in the mines as well. So when you talk about an underground mine like Sudan, there's a lot of timbers that go into building the shafts and the drifts as you go down, and these were from our forests here. And I show the image of these guys working in this kind of a line art etching here. And just to highlight that they moved the logs, moving the logs was extremely dangerous. And it was, we have, in fact, my son is a forestry student down at Stevens Point, Wisconsin, and they just are starting up a forestry sports club, which is like, log rolling and stuff like that. And I was just thinking about that as he's not really into it, but the club is into it, so he's into it. But rolling a log, being good at that is a really cool skill for the logging Olympics or the logging sports that you see. It's really cool. Sometimes you'll see it on ESPN Ocho or something. You might see something like that. It's a really cool skill. But at this time, it was literally a survival technique, because if you fell off the logs, the chances of you dying was extremely high, because these logs were all rolling down a river. Or in this case, as they're loading the logs, this was the most dangerous part. Those guys at the top got paid a little bit more, but they died a lot. And just, I don't mind, by the way, I have a dark and a kind of a macabre sense of humor. And so as I've researched history for these last 10 years, working on the book that I'm working on, I got really comfortable with death in a way that unsettles a lot of people. So I just want to acknowledge that, because I'm sorry if I don't mean to be disrespectful. But when I said I'm a narrative historian, I like to think about things, occupy the place that a person might have held in a period of time. We know so much better than those people 100 years ago. We have a lot of things we'd like to tell them about what they did, but we don't know exactly what it felt like to be in their shoes. And so I like to try on these shoes. And so I say something like, imagine being a logger in 1875. And let's say he has a son, and that son could have become a logger that logged in the White Pine Peak of around 1900 when they were bringing logs down to Virginia. And they both might have lived until 1929 to see that whole White Pine forest, for the most part, depleted entirely. They could have seen the whole thing. And that person's great-grandchild or grandchild could actually be in this room. And so I remember my great-grandmas and grandpas and them talking to me. I remember some stories they told me. That's how close we are, and yet how far we are from this period of time. Because we have a lot of loose ideas about the past, but we weren't there. and we didn't see and experience what they saw. We are completely shaped by this history, but we don't know what it looked like, and we really have to work hard to try to experience it. And so what I like to point out, and this is something, a little line I found, this is a college kid coming to Hibbing to take an internship of some kind in the mines. And he's writing his professor back at school. And I picked this out of a long letter about things that he had experienced, but it struck me as interesting. The scenery passed through on the way from Hibbing to Hibbing from Duluth is monotonous. It would not have been so bad if one could have ridden through forests instead of acres of stumps. And many of us know the experience of driving down Highway 53 to Duluth. And so we see trees now, and yeah, they're not old growth trees, but we imagine there being a lot of trees on that drive. But just imagine like hills of stumps and what that would have felt like and what that would have looked like. And what it would have felt like coming, this is 1902, by the way, so they're on a train. Think about riding a train through a strange land full of stumps and mud and piles of slash, and then you get off the train in a town. And this town, by all senses, would be the only thing on the planet Earth. You're in this totally isolated experience, and that's the experience that if you grew up here, many of our ancestors had coming here as immigrants, riding on a strange land with strange languages being spoken, on a train through stumps and destruction, and then landing in a town where they had to find a place and they had to find a life and a job and other things too. A lot of my history, I'll kind of just skip over this a little bit. Claude Atkinson was an editor. The old editors were friends of mine. I got to know them quite well. They did what I do, and they write about what's going on in their town and what's going on in their world. And they speak their opinions frankly, and they're often horrible people, but so are we. And so they're cloaked in the biases and opinions of their time, just as we are. And so Claude Atkinson talked about, and I'll skip over, this is a lot of reading, but he talked about going to a place just outside of Hibbing in Itasca County that was this beautiful forest, and then shortly after, a year later, he goes back there, it's all logged out. This was 1917. And so it just watching the landscape get changed right in front of you was happening in real time for these folks. And it kind of shows you what those folks experienced. I love this picture. Wouldn't mean much to a lot of people, but that's the first car to come to Hibbing. And it's owned by those two gentlemen. They hired the driver. That's what you did, by the way. If you were rich, if you had a car, and if you had enough money to buy a car, you sure as heck wouldn't bother learning how to drive it. You'd hire a local immigrant to drive you around, as these guys did. The guy on the right, Fred Smith, he's owned one of the first mechanic shops, what they called auto liveries, because at the time, people's conception of a car was as something that did the job of a horse, and therefore the place you would bring it to rest and recover would be an auto livery. And then the guy on the left is Walter Power, one of the early mayors of Hibbing, the older brother of my research subject, Victor Power. Walter was the guy who tricked the judges and the legal system into allowing Hibbing to pave its roads over the objection of U.S. Steel. Anyway, they own that car together. They're rich guys, but they had to go in on it. That's how expensive it was. And they're tooling around the edge of town. I just love this because you see some of the probably second growth trees, some of those. And then you see the pipes and the posts because they're building a road out on the edge of town. It's probably the mall now or something like that. But this is the country end of Hibbing here. And I just love this because that's what it was. It was a lot of dirt roads, a lot of messy construction, a lot of, like, you'd drive down a road and you'd see guys trying to get rid of stumps. And they'd be moving stumps their whole life, practically speaking. And so we drive around here and we see fields, but there was some guy who bought this land cheap who actually removed all the stumps, and they wanted to farm it, or they ended up making hay fields, and sometimes they don't do anything with the fields anymore because it was kind of hard to grow stuff. Just want to highlight this Marshner map. It was mapped in 1930, or the data came from 1930. kind of hard to explain on a little splotchy map. It could be an abstract work of art, or it could be very important scientific data. You be the judge. But if you look up in the top right, that will show you roughly where we are in Tower. And you'll see that if you do the color coding that it's one of the places where you still had white pine recovery after first logging. And so you had a lot of white and red pine that was here, and you had a lot of jack pine barrens and openings as well. And a lot of this is still there today, but this is the forest as it grew up after it was these massive white pine forests. It was a very different forest that grew up in the place of the old white pines. I want to highlight something a lot of you already know, and if you've done any research on the labor situation on the range, you know that the mines desperately needed labor, and so did the logging camps. And they actually worked in symbiosis quite often. You could get a labor force in for mining, but mining was a spring, summer, fall kind of job. And then once the weather got kind of rough and cold and the ground froze, you could send people out to the logging camps. And workers toiled year-round in some of the most dangerous jobs in the world. They actually still are in some places, logging and mining. We've improved a lot, but nevertheless, it can be dangerous work, and it certainly was when you were working with hand tools and horses. And some of these folks became prosperous and established people who could then buy companies or become, staid and respected members of society. Some of these immigrants Americanized and became very successful. And a lot of times our history tells their story more than others because they survived. But in truth, some of the research, there was a great book, logging, a professor down in the cities, she wrote a book about the lumberjack, the myth of the lumberjack. And these lumberjacks, they could do this, work in camps and work year-round in the mines. Maybe 5 years was pushing it, because if you survived that long, you better have kept your money, and a lot of times they didn't, but if you kept your money, you had something. But quite often these were what we would today call migrant laborers, and they were treated just like today's migrant laborers. As iron ore overtook logging as the more dominant local industry, the forests remained fuel. That's where they got the timbers for a lot of the underground mines. And then I always say, where did the forest of the Iron Range go? A lot of it was buried. It's down there now because it was used to build underground mines. And some of these have been filled in, some haven't. But there's a lot of wood down there, and it's from those original forests. Talking about forest fire, another topic that we've all gotten to know really well, or at least gotten to experience, is the effects of wildfire on our lungs this summer. Of course, the Canadian wildfires sent a lot of smoke our way, but we had our own wildfires here in northern Minnesota as well earlier in the spring. And so wildfire was a consequence of the way we logged back then. Today you hear about responsible logging being a tool to prevent out-of-control wildfires. But back then, they had logged everything and left nothing but fuel as far as the eye could see. And so some of the great fires in our history, most importantly the 1918 fire, though there were certainly others, came as a result of those stumps and slash we left everywhere. And that was a great historic lesson. 1908, there was a fire that raged through northern Itasca County into central St. Louis. Chisholm burned down, and they blamed slash piles and clear-cut logging practices of the time. And a lot of really educated people, and they're not like radicals, folks, but like solid business Republicans were saying, wait a minute, we gotta do something different with how we handle the forests, because clearly this is a big danger. And 1918 was the biggest example yet, because a train leaving, I forget if it was leaving or coming to Cloquet, but it was leaving Cloquet heading to Hibbing. and sparked on the side of the tracks. These were big metal machines, and they had sparks flying out the side of them, and they caught some brush on fire. Some workers thought they had put it out, but it was smoldering underneath, and on the day of the Great Fire, the winds were blowing incredibly hard. We experienced some days like that this summer. I can't think about anything else on those kind of days when it's hot and dry and the leaves aren't fully greened up yet, and you just know that the whole thing is a tinderbox. And that's what happened. Lost the city of Cloquet, lost the city of Moose Lake, and in fact that fire, people might not realize, came up to the range and was actually held back. You know, the range towns of that time were accused of being boondoggles with too many municipal workers on the payroll as part of a political plot. And fortunately, that was the case because they had robust fire departments and a lot of people to dig fire lines. And that's the reason a lot of the range towns didn't burn down that day. And then later, this is my example of creative forest management. I don't know if it applies to our current times, but they brought in sheep to kind of work on the underbrush and the slash and a lot of the things that had burned the previous year. After 1918, there were several years here on the range where you would find thousands of grazing sheep on the edge of a town that belonged either to the railroad or sometimes the villages, or they weren't, they weren't some farmers' sheep. They were municipal sheep. They were government sheep, or corporate sheep in other cases. And I don't mean that as a pejorative. They worked for the corporation, and they cleared out a lot of the brush. And then I often think when I see a sheep at the county fair, like is that a descendant of one of the fire sheep? I wonder. I don't know what happened to them all. I suspect what happened to a great many of them, especially as folks were hungry. You know what happened to them. Euros are delicious. But what we got out of that time, that period of really learning, of great destruction and then learning, is Minnesota's legacy of one of the most proactive states in fire suppression. Some would say perhaps, and there's arguments today about whether we're almost too proactive, but one of the reasons Minnesota is so proactive is that we have a lot of roads. We built a lot of roads, and we have a lot of rural real estate where there's houses and cabins and things. And we experienced this this year when we had those fires, and there was property loss in some of those fires, Camp House Fire and some of the others, Miller Chunk and some of those fires this year. Of course, that's bad. We don't want that. And Minnesota is very proactive in dealing with that. They fight the fire. What that means is they fight the fire until it's out. They don't stop. And they try to protect property and lives. And of course, we fortunately didn't lose any lives in those fires. But that fire is in fact part of the natural order as well. Fire is a great thing for replenishing a forest. There are actually species of trees like the jack pine and others that can only reproduce in the face of a fire that helps their cones open up. So it's kind of a two-way street. And of course, when we experience the smoke of Canada this year, what you're really dealing with there are these enormous boreal forests way far north. There's no roads, there's no towns up there. And so it is policy there to let it burn because there's really no good way to fight those fires, which is why we got so much smoke. And as the seasons have extended and gotten drier, on average, that's where a lot of that comes from. The legacy of conservation, I realize conservation, kind of has different meanings. Some would say that the early conservationists weren't quite so conservation-y, because they were still shooting animals as trophies, and they would shoot all the songbirds and put them up in their offices and stuff. And maybe we wouldn't want to do that today. It's not a very responsible way of handling wildlife. But they did have a sense that what was happening to the forests was bad, and when they realized that people who lived here wanted to hunt and fish and spend time in the great outdoors, and they grew to love that environment, just like Claude Atkinson did in the example I shared. They wanted to do something to preserve not only the forests but the wildlife and the woods that were there. The roads and actually expansion of roads and towns and houses out into the country caused two things that are still true largely. The elk and moose, that's supposed to say moose, not deer, but moose and elk moved north, and then the deer took over a lot of northern Minnesota. And people hunted deer back in the day, but they also hunted elk and moose just as regularly 100 years ago. Maybe 120 years ago. It was very common, just go up and shoot a moose or shoot an elk. It was just like shooting a deer to a large extent, because deer didn't come in until you cut down all those trees. And then they kind of took over. But what we do in modern forestry today, what my son is studying, he's a forestry student, is what we do to not only preserve forests as a timber resource is obviously what they'd say, but also all the negative outcomes of a century ago, whether it's the fire, whether it's the wildlife destruction, whether it's the habitat destruction. We're working, imperfectly perhaps, but working towards better solutions on these things, which is a positive. So that's me. I did this a little faster than I normally do it because I wanted to keep my time here. But and I talk about a lot of subjects, and what I point out, I didn't show you that slide about Victor Power, but I do have a book coming out. I don't know exactly when, but I've been working on it for 10 years. The book is written, and you don't want to know all this, but 290,000 words was my manuscript. And I don't know if you know words, but that's like 2 reams of paper. And people say, oh, I would read that book. No, you don't want to read that book. No. You say things like this, you don't know what you're saying, So I am working with my editor on bringing this down to a more manageable, liftable, portable tome that you could carry with you and read somewhere. It's about Victor Power and, yes, his fight with U.S. Steel, but also the complex times that U.S. Steel and Victor Power and Prohibition and immigration and all kinds of things played in the early history here in northern Minnesota. And it's a specific example that will have a lot of resonance, I think, for anybody in this region, because a lot of the stories are a little bit different town to town, but basically they really just threw a bunch of people in one place who previously had never been together and saw what happened. And what happened is, here we sit. That's what happened. And that's why I get really excited about history and the work that historical societies like this one do. It's always a good place to spend your membership dollars. It's always a good place to make your bids and help these folks out, because it takes work to preserve stories. And I've actually gone back and tried to find stories that weren't preserved, and it's really, really hard. And so the work that people do to archive, to record, to create memories that can be passed down, really important stuff for us as a human species, as people who can do better in the future and learn from our past. Really important things. So thank you so much for your time. Questions? There will be a period for questions.